ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Pedrorios.
Thank you. All right, thank you. I really like that line, walls fall. It resonates with the vision I think that we bring forward when we're constantly working and discovering that there are people out there that want to build not one wall, not two walls, but 3 walls and even more if they could. And we know that right now there are walls that are being constructed that are 30 feet high. And I'll tell you something, the 30-foot wall was done with a purpose. When we met with the local Border Patrol sector chief, he told us that the reason why it was built at 30 feet high was because they did a psychological analysis to determine at what height a normal human being would become disoriented when they're climbing a wall, should they intend to cross to the other side, to the US from Mexico. And they determined that 30 feet high was high enough to disorient the individual where that person would not continue to try to climb the border wall. And so there's a method to the madness of why walls are the height that we see them today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration and border issues and try to bring it back to why it's important to vote and to register to vote, and it's not too early to register, but it can be too late. So we have some tables here, and folks that are here, if you have not yet registered to vote, please do. And so I'm going to take us back a little bit in time. But before that, I want to just remind us of some of the current atrocities that we're seeing here today. And so some of the things that we've heard about and we've seen has been the separation of families. Not only the separation of families, but where children are caged up in what are now we call concentration camps. But before they were called concentration camps, many of us have been doing this for a long time, have known them to be called hieleras in Spanish. And they're called hieleras because they're essentially cold boxes, ice boxes. And so they're so cold that children are getting sick in there and they're not being tended to. And we see this day and day after day. In fact, recently I had a conversation with a woman who was detained at the Border Patrol station down on Bayer Boulevard in between South San Diego and San Isidro. And what she told us, the group that she was talking to, was that she could hear every evening or early morning at 1 a.m. when they would bring the young men, some of them teenagers, some of them adults, young adults, and they would line them up. And then she would hear that they would get beaten by Border Patrol agents, and she would hear the yells and the cries. And so essentially what would happen is that Border Patrol agents would line people up, and these young men, some of them teenagers, were instructed to put their arms up against the railing or the fence or whatever it was, and some of them did not, and that's when Border Patrol would strike them. And so she also heard the comments that some of the Border Patrol agents would make, especially to young women, especially to pregnant women, where they would mimic some of the comments that the president made about there not being enough room for migrants here in this country. There's no more room. Go back from where you came. And so she would hear how Border Patrol agents would make the same comments to these young women who were pregnant. And every day that they were there, they were fed 3 times. At 1 p.m., I believe at 7 p.m., then again at 1 a.m. And what they were given were burritos that were half cooked. And so when you stick one of those burritos in the microwave and you don't cook it long enough, the inside part continues to be frozen. And that's the food that they were given. In addition to that, crackers, peanut butter crackers, and some boxed juices. And so some of the women with their children would request for more food, but they weren't given more food because that's all they had. And one woman chose to not want to get any more food. She said, "I'm not going to eat your food because it's terrible, it's disgusting. How can you call this food?" And so the Border Patrol agent that came in said, "Okay, as a form of punishment, if you don't want the food, then no one else is going to get the food. So you decide at this moment. You can do whatever the hell you want with your food. You can give it to your neighbor, but if you don't take it, then no one else is going to get fed tonight." And that was the attitude that this agent gave to this woman who decided to protest while she's inside this hilera, this concentration camp. The power there then was that the agents representing the US government were imposing a form of collective punishment, almost torture, against these individuals who were fleeing their country because of all sorts of violence. In fact, agents would tell them, "You're not fleeing because of violence. We don't believe you. In fact, all you want to do is sell your body," but they use very terrible and descriptions about that, especially to the pregnant women. And so, what we have today, we can jump in a time machine and go back several decades. In fact, the modern era of border militarization and what we've seen, what we continue to see today, goes back to the late 70s when there was an increase of migration from the Central American countries that were dealing with civil strife because obviously US interventionist policies. And so the migration then in the 70s and the 80s led the US government to try to deal with migration in one way or another. And some of you might remember that in 1986, the IRCA, or what became known as the amnesty, was signed into law by then President Reagan. But it took a number of years before getting there, and a series of negotiations, one of which was the lessening of the Posse Comitatus Act that prevents the US government or US soldiers from being involved in domestic operations. And so because of that, the US soldiers, specifically the Marines, were then doing drug interdiction programs along the border with Mexico. And in one incident, going back in May 20th of 1997, I believe, Ezequiel Hernandez, a young man, 18, 19 years old, in Redford, Texas, was caring for the family's sheep and goats, and he had his grandfather's old musket, and he was walking and didn't realize that there was a platoon of Marines that were following him. And they followed him, and they kept following him, and he heard some rustling in the background, and so he turned around and fired a shot into the air. And so the Marines took that as a threat, and they shot him and assassinated him, and they left his body hung over a well. And you can find that information, Ezequiel Hernandez, who was shot and killed. In fact, there was a documentary done about this, the Ballad of Ezequiel Hernandez, that tells the story of how border militarization has impacted communities to the extent that right now we have roughly around 8,000 soldiers that are beefing up the border along Texas. Not including, obviously, the National Guards that have been there for a while as well. And the collaborative nature of the Department of Homeland Security with the Department of Defense in strategy, in tactical communications, in equipment that includes military scale equipment and the hollow point bullets that when fire explode upon impact. And so we see this time and time again. And though this has happened under both Republican and Democratic administrations, we can put a stop to that because, as someone referenced earlier, we are in a much more hyper sensitive or hyper conscious society about what's taking place around us, whether it's how climate change is impacting Central American countries that obligates people to have no other options but to migrate, or whether it's the civil strife that continues to occur there, or whether it was the hurricanes that impacted Haiti several years ago that created the exodus of Haitian migrants, first to South America and then coming all the way up through Central America to the US-Mexico border, or whether it's, you name it, migration is something that's impacting our entire world. And here along the US-Mexico border, we have to deal with it in a way that really resounds and brings forward a human rights perspective, because until now, all we've had have been war strategies to deal with migration. And so going back to that same time machine that I talked about, we go back to the Reagan era, it was the war on drugs. And we knew the the Iran-Contra scandal that was taking place there, and the armed trafficking that was being done along the U.S.-Mexico border. If we go into the 1990s, the war on criminals, which was really a war on poor people, and so we saw under Clinton, for instance, the Welfare Reform Act in 1996 that allowed for the persecution of people who were trying to improve their lives with public benefits. And then suddenly we move forward, and 2001 with the attacks on September 11th, we suddenly have the war on terror under Bush's son, and then under President Obama we had something else, which was the spillover violence. And so President Obama tried to do something different. He tried to push away this idea of the war on terror and tried to make it seem as though policies were different, but really they were, many of them were the same. I had an opportunity to visit one of the Border Patrol stations in the Rio Grande Valley when President Obama was president, and the Ursula station were these large cages where migrants were being held there. Children were there. And so these cages that we see now under the Trump era were around during the Obama era. And so unless we're making conscientious decisions about who we're voting for, we're going to keep having the same policies. But that can't change unless you register to vote. And registering to vote is part of the panorama of political actions that you can take. It's not the only thing. It should be combined with other sorts of activities. Organizing in your community. Talking to your co-workers. If you're an educator, talking to your students. If you're a student, talk to your fellow students. If you're at a workplace that's unionized or non-unionized, you can still activate them and say, hey, brother, sister, friend, let's register to vote. Let's make sure that we have, that we're counted in how we move together politically. And then let that not be the single action that you take politically to ensure that there is change in this country. Continue then to organize with your community, whether it's at the church or the mosque, or whether it's at the school or at the workplace, the corner street or at the park when you're playing soccer with your friends, whatever it might be. There's an opportunity there to bring people forward. And so, to quickly close up my spot here, I think that there are some incredibly dangerous actions that this government has taken of late. Some of which I think will leave a mark beyond whatever administration might come in 2020. Some of which include the changing of the judges, for instance. The Supreme Court, I think, will have a tremendous say for generations to come. But we can continue to make that change and have an impact, especially if we are mentors to someone. And so registering to vote, ensuring then that you take the next step in voting, and then after that continuing to organize in your community so that it's a continuum of actions and activities that you are participating in is as important as breathing sometimes, because you want to breathe in clean air. You want to make sure that the folks that are your neighbors are being treated with dignity and respect. And I'm talking about the neighbors to our immediate south as well, because we're part of the larger community. So I appreciate that this brigade here brings together the regional perspective of San Diego, Tijuana.